For about 50 years, there's been one experiment that seems to give us a pretty chilling answer to a huge question. Are people fundamentally good or evil? It's this famous story about some regular college kids, a fake prison, and a kind of darkness that supposedly is inside all of us. But what if that story, the one we've all heard, isn't the whole story? Today, we're going to dig into what really happened at the Stanford prison experiment.
So this was the big question from psychologist Philip Zimbardo back in the summer of 1971. And it's a powerful idea, right? Are you because of your character? Or does the situation you're in have the power to just completely change who you are? And to figure that out, he and his team decided, hey, let's build a prison.
Okay, so this is where the story that we all think we know really kicks off. And it's a story that has just fascinated millions. You take a bunch of ordinary, healthy college guys, and you randomly make some of them prisoners and some of them guards in a mock prison. The plan was for it to last 2 weeks. It didn't even make it through one. And the classic takeaway, the one you read about in textbooks, is pretty chilling. In less than a week, these student guards, who were no different from the prisoners, supposedly became sadistic and cruel. And the prisoners? They became passive, helpless. Some even had serious emotional breakdowns. The lesson seemed crystal clear. The situation is everything. All right, so how on earth did they even set this thing up? Zimbardo's team didn't just want some casual role play. No, they wanted to create what they called a functional simulation of a prison. It was designed to feel psychologically real from the second you were involved.
It all kicked off with a simple ad in the paper. They screened a ton of applicants to make sure they got the most normal, psychologically stable students. Then, a flip of a coin decided your fate, guard or prisoner. And then, to really sell it, and this is wild, the prisoners were arrested at their actual homes by real Palo Alto police officers, booked at the station, and then brought to the fake prison. Talk about setting a terrifying tone from minute one.
Now this part is absolutely crucial. The instructions they gave the guards, super vague. They were basically told, maintain law and order, but with no specific rules, no training. This ambiguity was totally intentional. It forced the guards to figure out for themselves just how far they could push their power.
And here's where things start to go downhill fast. This is the core of the story we've always been told. The guards, decked out in uniforms with clubs and reflective sunglasses to make them anonymous, very quickly started to exert their authority in some pretty cruel and, honestly, creative ways. So you have this one guard, Dave Eshelman, who becomes infamous. He basically channels this sadistic warden from the movie Cool Hand Luke. He even admitted later that he was treating it like an acting role. He consciously created this persona to, give the researchers something to work with. But his performance of cruelty quickly became the prison's reality. Things really blew up on day 2. The prisoners rebelled, shoving their beds against the doors to block the guards out. Zimbardo himself called this the turning point. The guards stopped seeing them as fellow students and started seeing them as dangerous. And they came down on them hard, stripping them naked, taking away their beds, using fire extinguishers on them. And you could see the psychological damage happening in real time. Prisoner 8612, a guy named Doug Corpus, seemed to have a total breakdown, screaming and raging in his cell. He was released, and that breakdown became the #1 piece of evidence for the crushing power of the situation. For decades, that was the story. End of discussion. But it wasn't. Over the last few years, though, things started to change. People started digging into the archives, listening to old tapes, and talking to the participants again. And a very, very different story began to emerge, one that makes us question this whole landmark study. So it makes you wonder, right? Was it really that simple? Do these guards just naturally turn brutal? Were the prisoners' breakdowns really spontaneous? Or was there something else pushing them along? The neat, tidy story we all knew was about to get very messy. And this right here is basically the smoking gun. This is a quote from one of Zimbardo's researchers, David Jaffe, on an old audio tape. He's literally coaching one of the guards who wasn't being mean enough, telling him he has to be a tough guard. This wasn't just observation. This was stage direction. So let's break it down. The classic story versus what we know now. The old story says guards just turned evil on their own. The critique? Researchers were pushing them to be tough. The old story says prisoners had genuine breakdowns. But it turns out Doug Corpy, the guy who had that famous screaming fit, later admitted he was faking it just to get out early so he could study for an exam. And maybe the biggest thing, Zimbardo wasn't a neutral scientist on the sidelines. He was playing the role of the prison superintendent, an active authority figure inside the experiment itself.
Okay, so if the whole bad situation makes good people evil theory is shaky, what was really going on in their heads? Well, modern psychology actually gives us a much more nuanced way to look at this.
So the classic theory they always taught in Psych 101 is something called de-individuation. The idea is simple. You put on a uniform, you wear sunglasses, you become an autonomous, and you lose your sense of self, your inhibitions. It's like you're lost in a crowd, so you feel like you can do things you'd never do on your own. But there's a newer and, frankly, more interesting idea, the social identity model. This model says you don't lose your identity, you just switch it out. You stop thinking of yourself as me, and you start thinking of yourself as us, as part of a group. And as soon as you do that, you become really motivated to follow whatever that group's rules are. And if you look at the guards through that lens, their behavior starts to make a whole new kind of sense. They weren't just randomly becoming monsters, they were actively choosing to embrace the specific group identity that the researchers had handed to them on a silver platter, the identity of a tough guard. They were playing the part they believed they were supposed to play.
So that brings us to the big question. If this experiment was so flawed, why are we still talking about it 50 years later? Why does it still have such a powerful hold on us?
Well, there are a couple of big reasons. For one, it tells a really simple, powerful story about good versus evil that just feels true. The photos and the videos are incredibly dramatic. But the story of how it ended is just as compelling. Because it wasn't Zimbardo or his team who stopped it. It was an outsider, a grad student named Christina Maslach, who was completely horrified by what she saw.
And get this, Maslach was actually dating Zimbardo at the time. When she showed up on the fifth night and saw what was going on, she wasn't just appalled by the guards. She was horrified by how Zimbardo himself had gotten sucked into his own role as the prison boss. She basically told him that if this was the real him, she wanted nothing to do with him. It was that very real, human, emotional response that finally snapped him out of it, and he shut the whole thing down the next day.
So, where does that leave us? Well, today, most psychologists don't see this as a real scientific experiment anymore. It's more of a powerful but deeply flawed demonstration. Its biggest lesson isn't really about good and evil. It's a cautionary tale about research ethics, the incredible influence of authority, and just how easy it is for all of us to get lost in the roles we're given. So, maybe the real lesson of Stanford isn't that we all have some secret monster inside us. Maybe it's about the stunning power of roles and how the expectations of the people in charge can totally shape who we become. It forces you to ask a pretty uncomfortable question. In your own life, what roles are you playing? Who wrote the script? And how is it shaping you?